Alberta Premier Danielle Smith gave a live stream address moments ago outlining her province's path forward with the Carney government, laying out several steps she says she will take in dealing with Ottawa. Here's some of what she had to say.
I will soon appoint a special negotiating team to represent our province in negotiations with the federal government on the following reforms requested by our province. We hope this will result in a binding agreement that Albertans can have confidence in. Call it an Alberta Accord, if you will. First, Alberta requires guaranteed corridor and port access to tidewater off the Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic coasts for the international export of Alberta oil, gas, critical minerals, and other resources in amounts supported by the free market rather than by the dictates and whims of Ottawa. Every province in the country, other than Alberta and Saskatchewan, have coastal port access, and no province needs it more given the size and value of our resources. This will benefit all Canadians to the tune of trillions of dollars of economic activity, including billions for First Nations partners. Second, the federal government must end all federal interference in the development of provincial resources by repealing the No New Pipelines Law, C-69, the oil tanker ban, the net zero electricity regulations, the oil and gas emissions cap, the net zero vehicle mandate, and any federal law or regulation that purports to regulate industrial carbon emissions, plastics, or the commercial free speech of energy companies. These laws are destroying investment confidence and costing Canada and Alberta hundreds of billions in investments each year. They need to go. Third, the federal government must refrain from imposing export taxes or restrictions on the export of Alberta resources without the consent of the government of Alberta. Frankly, all provinces should be given that same respect for their resources. And fourth, the federal government must provide to Alberta the same per capita federal transfers and equalization as is received by the other three largest provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. We have no issue with Alberta continuing to subsidize smaller provinces with their needs, but there is no excuse for such large and powerful economies like Ontario, Quebec, BC, or Alberta to be subsidizing one another. That was never the intent of equalization, and it needs to end. If these points can be agreed to by the federal government, I am convinced it will not only make Alberta and Canada an infinitely stronger and more prosperous country, but will eliminate the doubts a growing number of Albertans feel about the future of Alberta in Canada. While these negotiations with Ottawa are ongoing, our government will appoint, and I will chair, the Alberta Next panel. This panel will be composed of some of our best and brightest judicial, academic, and economic minds to join with me in a series of in-person and online town halls to discuss Alberta's future in Canada, and specifically, what next steps we can take as a province to better protect Alberta from any current or future hostile policies of the federal government. Details of the membership and scope of that panel will be released in the coming weeks. After the work of the panel is finished, it is likely we will place some of the more popular ideas discussed with the panel to a provincial referendum so that all Albertans can vote on them sometime in 2026. To be clear from the outset, our government will not be putting a vote on separation from Canada on the referendum ballot. However, if there is a successful citizen-led referendum petition that is able to gather the requisite number of signatures requesting such a question to be put on a referendum, our government will respect the democratic process and include that question on the 2026 provincial referendum ballot as well. I also want to state unequivocally that as Premier, I'm entirely committed to protecting, upholding, and honoring the inherent rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Therefore, any citizen-initiated referendum question must not violate the constitutional rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and must uphold and honor Treaties 6, 7, and 8, should any referendum question ever pass. This is non-negotiable. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, that being separation. We are well aware that there is a large and growing number of Albertans that have lost hope in Alberta having a free and prosperous future as a part of Canada. Many of these Albertans are organizing petitions to trigger a citizen-initiated referendum, as I mentioned earlier. The vast majority of these individuals are not fringe voices to be marginalized or vilified. They are loyal Albertans. They are quite literally our friends and neighbors who've just had enough of having their livelihoods and prosperity attacked by a hostile federal government. They're frustrated, and they have every reason to be. I want to talk directly to those Albertans. I know how frustrated so many of you have become with our country and the feeling of having politicians living thousands of miles away, passing laws and rules that have cost you your loved ones, jobs, careers, dreams, and opportunities for a brighter future. As most Albertans know, I have repeatedly stated I do not support Alberta separating from Canada. I personally still have hope that there is a path forward for a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada. And let me explain a few reasons why. First, Alberta already has and can continue to use the Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act and other measures to fight
that
through
is some of what Alberta
of
Premier
Ottawa's
Danielle
damaging
Smith had to say there. And listening along with us, Radio Canada's Anne-Marie Trickey. She is in Calgary. There is a lot to unpack there, Anne-Marie. Where do you want to start? What stood out for you?
A lot to unpack. So we heard at the beginning of this address to the nation, as Danielle Smith put it, she said she really understood where Albertans how they were feeling, that frustration with regards to the result of the federal election. Of course, that happened only a week ago. She said that she did have a good first step, a good first meeting with Mark Carney last Friday, but she said something that really stood out to me, which was actions speak louder than words for Albertans, and she really talked about steps to protect Alberta from Ottawa. She talked about this special negotiating team to represent Alberta in these kinds of negotiations and for a binding agreement between the province and Ottawa, so an Alberta Accord of sorts. Really, she talked about four things that she wants to focus on. So requiring access to corridors, really to tidewaters off of the Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic coasts. And that's, of course, to export the natural resources in the province. Also, that the federal government has to end interference in terms of resource management and resource laws. So we can think about this net zero grid regulations, the C-69 No New Pipelines Act, and also this tanker ban off of the coast of BC. Also, Danielle Smith reiterated the fact that no export tax can be imposed on these resources coming from Alberta without the province's agreement. And finally, she talked about really the federal government giving the same per capita federal transfer and equalization as is received by the other three largest provinces. So we're talking about Ontario, Quebec, and BC. And she said that large economies don't need to be subsidizing other large economies within Canada.
Well, one thing I want to ask you about, Anne-Marie, I thought it was striking there. She was saying, well, I don't support Alberta separation. I think it's important for people to understand that she is in the process of lowering the bar, making it easier for a referendum on a question like that. Can you give us a bit of that context?
Right, and she actually announced this new legislation the next day after the federal election. She did say that it was a coincidence, but she did mention with these election reforms, the threshold actually for referendums are much lower now. So we're talking about 10% of the voters in the last election that people need for a petition to get this kind of question in a referendum. She has repeated, as you said, that she supports Alberta in a united Canada, that her government will not put forward any kind of referendum question. But if there is a citizen-led question that reaches this threshold of 10% of voters in the last election, well, she will be forced to put it on this referendum. And actually, in this address, she spoke about going on a panel and asking Albertans about what kind of ideas they would have for the future of Alberta, and that there could be some referendum questions coming up in 2026. the government won't put forward this referendum in terms of separation, of course, from Canada. But she did say that if there is a citizen-led question that does meet the threshold, it could be included in this 2026 referendum.
I do want to ask you one more question, Anne-Marie, about the public mood in a second, but I just want to loop back around to what you were saying earlier about C-69. Danielle Smith, a lot of Conservatives call it the No New Pipelines Act. It is, in fact, called the Impact Assessment Act, and Mark Carney ran on keeping it, in contrast with what the Conservatives were doing, just changing things around, trying to, he says, make it easier to get projects put ahead. So some of the stuff she's thrown out there is a little bit provocative. I wonder, on the question of Alberta secession, what can you tell us? We know there was a protest over the course of the weekend. What can you tell us about the public mood in Alberta around these questions and around Danielle Smith?
So as you were saying, there was a significant protest actually that happened Saturday. We did see some American flags even in that protest. So the mood is frustrated. Of course, the majority of Albertans voted for the Conservative Party. Danielle Smith speaking directly really to Albertans, saying, I understand, I know how you feel, but there is still possibly hope in negotiating with the federal government, with Mark Carney. She did underline the fact that there is a new prime minister and that she is open to working with him. But of course, we've heard it over and over from Danielle Smith saying that it will take a lot of work, a lot of cooperation from the federal government to mend this relationship with the province. And it starts with really repealing a lot of these acts, like you mentioned, C-69, for example, and really working with the province to get to a better place.
Well, and also to take into consideration the distance between the political frustration that some Albertans are feeling versus the number of Albertans who might be ready to meaningfully entertain a discussion about secession. A lot packed in there. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for taking the time to help us unpack it. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
That's Radio Canada's Anne-Marie Trickey in Calgary.